Good morning, Title I coordinators. Thanks for joining us for the February webinar. I'm Erin Sutton, and I'm the branch manager of the Title I Part A Support and Improvement branch. And if you're just joining, if you could make sure you're on mute, thank you. And I'll let my colleague introduce himself.
Can't find my mute button. Hello, I'm David Malonte, one of the assistant directors in the Division of School and Program Improvement.
All right, our usual housekeeping items before we get started. Again, make sure that you've got your microphone muted and your camera turned off so everybody can focus, and it looks like we've all done that. And if you have questions or comments, you can put those in the chat, or you can send those to me in an email at erin.suddeth@education.ky.gov. And of course, we are recording our webinar, and it will be posted to our webpage either later today or sometime tomorrow. Right, if you weren't able to join us for the January webinar, that recording is up on our webpage, and the main focus was some common Title I misconceptions. So I highlighted some of the issues that we've seen during our review of this year's Title I applications, as well as some of the evidence that we've seen in desk monitoring. And that included some discussion around per pupil amounts and rank and serve violations. We also talked about school level budgets and spending, parent and family engagement, of course, and then just some general spending reminders. So I strongly recommend watching that recording if you weren't able to join us, or maybe watching again, even if you were able to join us. The information that I shared can really help prevent your application from being returned as not approved, as well as avoiding compliance findings if you are selected for monitoring. Today, we have all of our usual announcements and reminders, and then our main focus is going to be around time and effort, which is another somewhat common finding area for us. I think everybody knows that the final FY25 allocations are now uploaded in GMAP, and that is for those of you whose original FY25 application has received full consultant approval from all of the different participating programs. So make sure that you go in and review your application as soon as possible and make the appropriate adjustments if your allocation amount changed. And just as a reminder, in our December webinar and our February newsletter, I provided some details on what pages may require your attention after your allocation changes. We also have a link here to the updated parent and family engagement non-regulatory guidance that the U.S. Department of Education released last month. This is mostly technical updates. The last time this guidance was released was April 2004. So they went through and they made some updates to make sure everything reflected parent and family engagement requirements under ESSA as opposed to parent involvement under No Child Left Behind. So be sure that you refer to this updated version for all of the latest insights and recommendations. So we've got a link on the slide as well as in the Title I handbook. Our census poverty and hold harmless percentages for next school year are also available. Those are up on our webpage, and you can use that information along with your final allocation amount to start planning for the 25-26 school year. Just a couple of reminders about that information. First of all of those numbers are tentative and they are subject to change. They also reflect statistical estimates that are determined by the Census Bureau, and they use a number of different sources when they're coming up with those estimates. So these are not going to align with your enrollment numbers, your free and reduced price lunch, nothing that you track or that KDE tracks. If you think that there's an issue or you have questions about those numbers, you need to contact the Census Bureau, specifically the SAPI branch, Small Area Income and Poverty Estimates. They're going to have that information for you, not KDE, unfortunately. And if you think that there is an issue and you want to challenge that data, you do have a window to do that with them. And that window ends on March 17th. And if you click on the document on our webpage, it's got all the instructions in there for how to contact them. Okay, looking at our obligation of this year's funds. Remember, this is just kind of an estimate to help make sure you're on track to have 85% or more obligated within the first 15 months of the award period. So that's by September 30th of 2025. So by the end of February, we're at about 45, about halfway through. If you are significantly below that percentage, make sure you're touching base with your finance officer to see if you're going to be on track to meet that carryover requirement, or if you're maybe going to have to request a carryover waiver for those of you who are eligible. And remember that you can use Project 310L funds to pay for allowable and approved expenditures dating back to July 1st of 2024. And this is just our quick reference table with all of the different projects that are currently open right now. The next deadline is going to be for school year 22-23 funds. We did get an extension on that award, and it ends on June 30th. So all of those funds need to be spent or encumbered by that point. And this month's Title I newsletter, we had a lot of great information in there. A lot of the announcements I just shared, final allocations, census, poverty, and hold harmless. We also had kind of part 2 in our time and effort series. In January, we talked about single cost objectives. And then in the February issue, we talked about multiple cost objectives. A reminder about initiating contact with private and homeschool officials if you haven't already done that. A link to another updated non-regulatory guidance document from USAID about preschool and Title I. Our principal's perspective article was about effective transitions between the different grade levels. And then we had our usual recurring reminder articles. And our last little update before we get into our main content is suggested tasks for February. And this is a new addition to our webinars based on some feedback that you all provided in that feedback survey that we always share with you. So the full list of year at a glance activities is in the Title I handbook. So this isn't all inclusive, and some of the items could vary based on your district's individual systems and processes. But this just gives you a general idea of what you should be thinking about this month in addition to your ongoing tasks that you handle every month. So consider the activities and services that your schools provide to prepare your incoming preschoolers for kindergarten. If you haven't already started planning those, now is the time to do that. And you should also be thinking about the transition supports provided to your other students. So our elementary schoolers going to middle school, middle to high, and then our high school moving on to the different post-secondary pathways. And then that year at a glance also has a list of ongoing tasks throughout the year. So I've just added a few of those to the slide. Don't forget to think about the things that you do more than once a year. So how often are you meeting with your Title I school principals, talking about their program implementation? How often are you visiting participating private schools or meeting with other district level staff, such as the homeless liaison, to discuss current needs, monitor the spend down of those set aside funds? Meetings with your finance officer to look at GMAP and compare that to Enterprise ERP, ensure that funds are being spent timely. The frequency of these tasks, like I said, it's going to depend on what works best for your district. But whether something is happening weekly or monthly, every other month, establishing a set schedule will really help you to consistently address your responsibilities as the program coordinator. And then documenting that you regularly attend to these items, so saving emails, detailed meeting minutes, all of that stuff, that helps illustrate program compliance in the event that you're selected for monitoring. Okay, our main topic this month is a deep dive into the time and effort section of the Title I handbook. And that was another suggestion from our feedback survey, was taking a closer look at different sections of the handbook. So this is on pages 53 through 56. It is a very short section, but the concept of time and effort can be a lot to really wrap your head around. So we're going to talk about the requirements of time and effort, as well as how to correctly document it and hopefully avoid any compliance findings. So we know that everything that you use federal funds for, including salaries, needs to be allocable. That means that it is meeting the intent of the Title I program. Time distribution records are need to be maintained for all employees that are paid with Title I funds or your other programs, Title II, Title III, etc. This is employees whether they're paid fully from that program or partially from that program. And a lot of times we refer to these as time and effort records. These records need to reflect an after-the-fact distribution of the actual activity of the employee, and they need to be signed by both the employee who performed the work and the supervisor who has the firsthand knowledge of that work that was performed. And like I mentioned a minute ago, our January and February newsletters have articles about these, so this webinar is kind of tying all of that together. These are the time and effort record requirements that are outlined in the Uniform Grant Guidance, specifically to CFR 200.430. And I'm not going to read every single line here, but your time and effort records need to be supported by a system of internal controls. So the actual steps that you're taking regarding time and effort. You want to incorporate these into your official records. I know a lot of you have different policies and procedures manuals and things like that. You want to make sure that records reasonably reflect the total activity for that the employee is compensated for. This should encompass federally assisted and all other activities. You want to make sure you're, of course, complying with any established accounting policies and things like that, and then support the distribution of the salary and wages across the different activities or cost objectives. So time and effort procedures. Written policies and procedures are essential to implementing an effective time reporting system, or lots of other systems as well. And just like any written procedures developed by the district, time and effort procedures must provide sufficient detail to permit an understanding of how that system is actually going to operate in your district. So these procedures ensure that time and effort records accurately reflect the work that was performed, again, including that after the fact reporting that I just mentioned. And we're talking about step-by-step instructions. We're not talking about a blanket policy that says something like, employees will maintain time and effort documentation. That's important too, but this is going to be those step-by-step procedures that are specific to your district. And this is one of the things that KDE looks at during monitoring visits. And a lack of procedures is a somewhat common finding. We see the policies with the blanket statements a lot, but we don't always see the actual steps. And I should also mention that a lot of times these procedures aren't specific to Title I. They might be for all of the different federal programs. And I know we've got some of our other KDE people from other federal programs on this meeting as well. So the procedures should include several different instructions. First is the completion of reporting. So how are you documenting time and effort? What actual documents are being used? Information on the approval cycle. How often is this occurring? For some employees, it might be monthly, and then while for other employees, it might be every 6 months. And we'll get into that a little bit more shortly. Processing, how's the documentation actually submitted? Is it physical paper copy? Is it some sort of online system? Information on the internal review process. So who do these get submitted to? Who reviews them? Who verifies that this work happened? Who approves the records and signs off? Then we've got the necessary adjustment required. So what's the process for reviewing all of the documentation at the end of the year, calculating the percentage that was worked on each program, and verifying that the correct amount was actually charged to each award? And that is something that has to occur at least annually. So a big factor in time and effort reporting are cost objectives. A cost objective is a function, an organizational subdivision, contract, grant, or other activity for which cost data are needed and for which costs are incurred. So the number of cost objectives that employee works on is going to determine what type of time and effort documentation needs to be maintained. So first up, we've got a single cost objective. We're talking about a single grant, a single function, or a single activity. So this could be someone who is paid entirely from a single funding source, such as Title I, or someone who is paid from multiple funding sources who's working on a single activity. So for example, let's think about a math intervention teacher at a school. Maybe they are paid 50% with Title I and 50% with general funds. The single activity of that employee is math intervention. That's all they're doing. And we also see on the slide, this is a little caveat, that single activity could be supported in full by either funding source. So we know that we could pay for a math intervention teacher fully from Title I or fully from general funds. So that is someone who is working on a single cost objective. Then we've got multiple cost objectives, so multiple functions, grants, or activities. In this scenario, we're talking about an employee who is working on completely different activities. For example, let's say we have someone who is a coach and they spend part of their time supporting the school's professional learning with the teachers. And then they spend another part of their time providing reading intervention for students. So professional learning for teachers, reading intervention for students, those are two completely separate activities. Those are multiple cost objectives. And we do have additional examples of each cost objective in the handbook, as well as in those newsletter articles that I mentioned. And with multiple cost objectives, these items could not be supported in full by the individual funding sources. When we think about the different ways to document time and effort, the first one that you've probably heard of is called a semi-annual certification. It's a very common method for this documentation, and this is for those employees working on a single cost objective. Semi-annual certifications are completed every 6 months. Remember, we need that after the fact reporting, so it has to be completed after the work's actually been done. So for the period January 1 through June 30th, we're going to need to make sure that that documentation is completed July 1st or shortly thereafter. And then, of course, for the July 1st through December 31st period, they would complete that on January 1st of the following year. We do have a template for a semi-annual certification in our sample folder on our webpage. And on the right-hand side of the slide, I have just an example semi-annual certification. You can see it's pretty short and straightforward. The first thing is just a very short paragraph. It's a statement of the requirement, saying that the employees have to fill out this documentation because of how they're paid. Then we have a sentence where the employee has filled in their name, the date range. So in this case, it's July 1st through December 31st of 2024. And just a very brief description of the single cost objective that they worked on. So for example, providing math intervention support to students. Then below that, we can see that the employee and the supervisor have both signed this document. And we can see that the signatures are dated January 2025, meaning that they completed this after the work was actually performed. The other type of time and effort documentation that you're probably familiar with is called a Personnel Activity Report, or PAR. This is for our employees who are being paid from multiple cost objectives. These are going to be completed, again, after the fact and on a monthly basis. And we also have a template PAR in our sample documents folder. So we need to make sure that we're recording the actual time that was worked on each cost objective. Another important thing, the employee should not manipulate the time recorded to arrive at a specific percentage. So those are the two things I want to focus on. If you look at the example image on the right, and we look at this person is paid from 2 different funding sources, you'll notice that each day does add up to 8 hours, but the employee spent a different amount of time on each cost objective from day to day. Some days could be split right down the middle. Other days, you may work solely on one cost objective and not the other. The employee needs to document what they've actually done. That's very important. They don't need to be manipulating the time to arrive at a specific percentage. So all the employee is responsible for is recording their actual time, whatever they've done. And then at the end of the year, the total amount of time spent on each cost objective should be added up to ensure that the appropriate amount was charged to each program. If the actual time recorded does not align with the full-time equivalency, the FTE amounts that you entered in GMAP, and especially with the amounts that were charged to the programs, you will need to go in and make some adjustments. So if we're using this image as an example, let's say that this person, the district kind of estimated that they'd be paid 50% from Title I and 50% from general funds. But at the end of the year, they went back and they looked at all of these documents, and it turned out it was more of a 40-60 split. So they would need to go in and make sure that only 40% of salary expenses were charged to Title I, not that full 50, because they didn't work 50% of their time on Title I. Couple time and effort reminders. Coordinators need to very carefully consider all the different roles and responsibilities that they have when they're thinking about the percentage of time that they spend on Title I. So I know a lot of you work on programs outside of Title I. A lot of people are federal programs coordinators. You handle all of the different programs. Many of you also serve in other district roles. You're assistant superintendents and DPPs or DACs. If any of your salary is paid with Title I funds, you need to be sure that you're only charging Title I related activities to the program. So activities such as completing the Title I application, doing your comparability report, meeting with and visiting your Title I schools to talk about the program or review the budget, all of those things that are directly related to the Title I program, that can be supported with Title I funds. Just because a school receives Title I funds, it doesn't mean that every single thing that happens in that school is a Title I activity. So let's say that you're the DPP. Even if all of the schools in your district are served by Title I, not all of the work that you do as the DPP may be tied to the Title I program. So that's what you kind of have to figure out. And of course, all expenditures, including staff, need to be reasonable, allocable, and necessary to address the identified need. Right, next we have a little time and effort pop quiz. And since everybody's in teams, they can put their answers in the chat. So our first question is, a district uses Title I and Title III funds to pay for a bilingual paraeducator who's going to provide supplemental support to English learner students at a Title I school. So what type of time and effort documentation should that paraeducator maintain? Do we want a semi-annual certification, or do we want a personnel activity report? And bonus points if you can tell me why. Okay, I'm going to give you a hint. Nobody's got it right yet. Ellen's got it. All right. Semi-annual certification. All right. This was kind of a trick question. And I see a lot of you guys are putting, they would need a PAR because they're being paid from multiple cost objectives. They're being paid from multiple funding sources, but what is their cost objective? They're working on a single cost objective, providing supplemental support to those English learner students. So they could complete a semi-annual certification, even though they're being paid from two different grants. That's a single cost objective. Okay, next pop quiz question. A district serving all schools with Title I funds wants to support the district bookkeeper's salary with Title I funds. Can the bookkeeper's salary be paid 100% with Title I funds? Yes or no, and why? Right, I see Tiffany and Jason have both said no, but why? All right, Amy's got it in there first. So That's right. They cannot be paid 100% with Title I funds because they'll work with other funding sources as the bookkeeper, unless, maybe in a very large district you had specifically just a Title I bookkeeper. But if this person's also doing general funds and other title programs, all of that, that is multiple cost objectives, multiple different funding sources. So they would need to do a personnel activity report. So it looks like everybody was getting that one right after the first trick question. All right, so that is going to wrap up today's webinar. Does anybody have any questions before we go? And I'll check on email.
Nothing in chat right now.
Okay, so do have one on email. So are schedules still required for semi-annual certifications to show that the employee's duties align to the needs of the school-wide program? I would say not necessarily.
So Erin, I'll add to that just a little bit. There does have to be some sort of supplementary documentation to support a PAR or a semi-annual. So having a schedule, for example, master schedule in a school building would work. Time sheets, things of that nature to back up that documentation.
So yeah, stuff that you're probably already doing and already have. Okay. I don't see any more questions at the moment.
I have one in chat.
Oh, okay.
Can you give us any insight on possible cuts in federal funding, specifically Title I? But no, not really. We're kind of at the mercy of administrative decisions at this point. We have not, other than the census data, we have not gotten any other information about tentative amounts, or at this point I haven't seen the budget that's making its way through. So at this point, unfortunately, no, we can't. I would tell you to watch the news. I would tell you to read some synopses of the budget, or to read the federal budget itself. But at this point, without having read that myself, it's hard to tell.
I will say this question came up, I think, back in December. Maybe there was some stuff floating around of, oh, Title I's going to be cut by X percent. And one of the things that David pointed out during that webinar was, number one, we don't know that, like he just said. But number two, even if something were cut by 10%, whatever, that does not mean that every single state and every single district across the board would see a cut of that percentage. So that's something to kind of keep in mind as well. I feel like we're taking a lot of what we see right now with a lot of grains of salt. That's pretty much all we can do, unfortunately. All right. So you are welcome. Our next webinar is going to be on March 27th from 10 to 11. And I've mentioned our feedback survey a couple of times during this webinar, so we do always value your feedback. I enjoy looking at that and seeing what you liked or what you'd like to see more of. So you've got a link in the slide. It's also in the newsletter and the email that I sent to you. I did just see a piece of feedback after last month's webinar suggesting having different districts maybe share some parent and family engagement ideas. So that's something I can try to work on our end. Right. I do not see any other questions, so we will go ahead and sign off. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in March.